March 7, 1944. A narrow strip of the Lido Road, 10 miles south of Myitkyina, Burma. The morning fog hung low like a wet blanket, clinging to the leaves, and the cracked faces of men who hadn't slept more than an hour in 3 nights. The jungle was a living thing here. Vines that tugged at boots, mosquitoes that drilled like tiny nails, the damp smell of rot and oil mixed together. Somewhere upstream a river moved with the slow certainty of history. To the men here, it was a rumor of water and death. Lieutenant Henry Caldwell of the U.S. Engineer Detachment wiped mud from his goggles and listened. He could hear only 2 things: the far, rhythmic rumble of tracked engines, and the quiet, taut breathing of his own squad. At first the Japanese sentries saw only the trees. Corporal Sato, a gaunt, tobacco-stained veteran of the 33rd Division, was crouched behind a knee-high rise of earth, his fingers clasped around the bark of a fig tree. He had been taught to expect tanks on open ground, in the deserts of China or the plains of Manchuria. Not here, in a place where the canopy knotted the sky into a patchwork of dark. Through the undergrowth he watched shapes move, first a glint of metal, then a soft cough that grew into a mechanical growl. He tightened his grip and cursed the sound was wrong for this theatre. It was American. On the other side, Sergeant James, Jimmy, Mallory, driver of Sherman M4A4 tank number 37, hunched over levers and gauges. The Sherman smelled of oil, sweat, and old gunpowder, the familiar odor that made men think of home fires and funerals at once. Mallory's crew had been stuck in jungle hell for weeks. Their maps were soggy, their boots were cracked, and their radio sputtered like a dying thing. Yet there was purpose in the clanking of their tracks. Ahead, bulldozers from the 8023rd Engineer Battalion already carved a rough path, steel teeth biting stumps, earth folding away, creating a line through what the Japanese believed impassable. The first Sherman rolled through the cut like a promise. Its turret sliced the low branches, vines slapped against its hull and slid off. The caterpillar treads chewed through mud that would have swallowed anything lighter than a tree. Men who had spent months imagining tanks as myth now stared in a silence that was almost prayerful. For the Japanese, watching through a slit of foliage, the sight was like a trick of the gods. 12 tons of armoured steel pushing through a green ocean. Captain Arima, commander of a local infantry company, moved with the dry, efficient motions of someone used to making do. He had seen Allied armoured vehicles before. Reconnaissance elements, light tanks, the occasional Stuart. But never this. He had positioned machine guns and dug shallow foxholes beneath the camouflaged canopy, counting on the jungle to swallow any heavy machine. The American convoy ruined that calculation. Each Sherman punched forward, accompanied not only by infantrymen, but by engineers and their bulldozers. Flamethrowers clipped in place, supply trucks following like obedient bloodhounds. Why would they come this way? Sergeant Sato asked no one, his voice swallowed by a chorus of cicadas. The question hung in the humid air like steam. No one had an answer that didn't sound like a surrender. The Japanese had prepared for monsoon mud, for ambushes, for the poison of illness and isolation. They had not prepared for the relentlessness of American logistics and the stubborn ingenuity of men whose doctrine was to move. Until the enemy moved no more. From the Sherman's interior, radio crackle brought fragments of orders. Advance, clear, hold. And with them the muffled hum of a small, insistent confidence. Lieutenant Caldwell's engineers worked in tandem, laying fascines and cutting down strangler figs to make room for the tracks. They were not simply following the tanks, they were partners in a mechanical ballet, clearing, repairing, shoring up culverts and bridging streams with pre-fabricated Bailey sections in minutes that seemed like miracles. Each collapse of a stump, each shiver of earth as a dozer clawed through debris, was a signal to the men in the camouflaged pits that the battlefield had shifted beneath their feet. Bullets began to pepper the convoy as Japanese snipers realized the truth. These were not ghosts. A Sherman paused, its commander peering through the hatch, eyes narrowed against both sunlight and disbelief. A machine gunner opened fire, the sharp staccato of 30 rounds biting into the green. The Sherman replied with a single controlled burst from its 75 mm main gun, not at the canopy but at a slope where brush hid a line of dug-in rifles. Trees exploded into showers of leaves, earth erupted, and a silence fell like a closing curtain. The Japanese positions trembled, then fell silent. Men, shells, and plans all seemed to compress into a single, terrible realization. The jungle no longer belonged to them. For the soldiers watching, the Americans in steel and the Japanese in khaki and torn cloth, time narrowed. Heat amplified sounds. The clang of metal, the small, human noises of a man reloading, the guttural bark of the Sherman's engine. The idea they had cherished, that nature would be a neutral ally, slipped away with each clump of earth the bulldozers dragged aside. The Shermans were not merely machines, they were a message in motion, supply lines, engineers, and tanks coordinated so effectively that terrain itself was being rewritten into a theatre. The Japanese had not expected to fight on. And as the column pushed deeper, the first shock took hold among the defenders' disbelief, then panic, then the slow, inevitable acceptance that plans forged in the cool rooms of command were no match for iron, ingenuity, and men willing to make the jungle a new kind of battlefield. The first line of Japanese resistance broke, not with a grand charge or coordinated retreat, but with the subtle, sickening sound of boots slapping mud in panic. Corporal Sato stumbled back, rifle clutched against his chest, heart hammering. The Sherman's 75 Bindumsru shell had torn apart the tree line as if it were paper. Smoke rose in grey ribbons, mingling with the jungle's wet breath around him. Men who had spent months digging trenches and wiring defences now stared at the advancing armour, with a numbness that came from seeing the impossible. Captain Arima barked orders, trying to rally his men. Positions! Flank them! Draw them into the trees! But there were no trees thick enough, no foxholes deep enough to make a difference. The Shermans didn't need clearings anymore. The engineers were creating their own. Bulldozers shoved aside what nature had spent decades growing, turning a wall of vines and hardwood into an ugly but functional corridor of churned mud. What should have been an unassailable natural fortress was dissolving like wet sand. On the American side, Lieutenant Caldwell walked behind the armour with his engineers, machete swinging. He wasn't a man of speeches, but even he couldn't help muttering. They thought this was impassable. He gestured toward a fallen banyan tree, its massive roots already being sawed apart by men with portable chainsaws. The convoy moved like a living organism. Shermans in front. Dozers clearing, infantry close behind. They were sweating through their uniforms, faces streaked with mud and insect bites, but they were advancing. Every inch of ground they gained was another nail in the coffin of Japanese defensive doctrine. The Japanese counterfire grew more desperate. Light machine guns rattled from hidden emplacements, but their rounds pinged uselessly off Sherman hulls. A 37 Mendes anti-tank gun barked from somewhere near the ridgeline. The shell struck the glycis of the lead tank with a sharp clang and ricocheted. The crew inside barely flinched. In the command tank, Captain Robert, Bob. Mikhail tapped the radio set and gave the order with a grin. Put it down. The gunner elevated, rotated, and fired. The blast swallowed the gun position in a white, yellow flash, sending shards of splintered wood and broken earth into the air. The Japanese infantry had expected tanks to be slow, confused, easy to ambush here. Instead, the Shermans moved with an unsettling rhythm grind, clear, fire, move again. Their coaxial Brownings swept the underbrush with devastating efficiency. Small squads tried to slip between the armour and the engineers, hoping to lob grenades or set satchel charges, but American infantry teams were waiting, carbines snapping, BRs roaring. The jungle amplified every sound into something larger, more terrifying. It felt like fighting a storm. In a makeshift command dugout 100 meters behind the shattered front, Captain Arima studied a hand-drawn map pinned to a bamboo table. His finger traced the tight bends of the Lido Road. They were supposed to stop at the river. That's where they were supposed to die. His second, in command, Lieutenant Nakamura, said nothing. They both could hear the rumble of armor growing closer, a sound more decisive than any report. Arima clenched his jaw, knowing this was no longer a matter of tactics. The Americans had changed the terrain itself. Further up the column, Private Eddie Rivas trudged alongside his Sherman with a pickaxe slung over his shoulder. He was 19, from San Antonio, and hated the jungle more than anything he'd ever known. But even through the exhaustion, he could feel it, that strange sense of momentum. The men knew the Japanese hadn't expected this. Rivas spat into the mud and muttered to his buddy. They thought the jungle was theirs. Guess not anymore. Back at the forward Japanese trench, Sergeant Sato realized their carefully planned kill zones were meaningless. Mortar teams struggled to adjust as paths appeared where none had been. Their camouflage nets and traps were built around static terrain. But the terrain was moving, reshaped under American steel and sweat. When another Sherman emerged, its hull coated in vines like a beast wearing the jungle's own skin, Sato whispered under his breath, "Tanks in the trees." The sun began to cut through the canopy, turning the mud into a shining brown mirror. It was barely past noon, and already the Japanese forward platoons were fragmenting. They had counted on time to slow the Americans, days, maybe weeks. Instead, the Shermans and engineers had ripped through what should have been a natural fortress in hours. Captain Arima grabbed his field phone, trying to reach regimental command. The line crackled with static. He could hear distant shouting, gunfire, and somewhere the shriek of incoming shells. The Americans were advancing on multiple axes, not just his sector. He looked at Nakamura and said softly, "The jungle betrayed us." But it hadn't. It was simply no match for bulldozers, bridge-laying crews, and tanks that refused to stop. By late afternoon, the fog that had blanketed the jungle at dawn had burned away into a wet, oppressive heat. The air shimmered in the humid light, and every breath tasted of rust and soil. What had been a tangled wilderness that morning was now a churned-up, ugly, practical road, a scar carved through green flesh. And leading that scar like a spearpoint was the Sherman column, engines growling, tracks grinding, their hulls mottled with mud and shredded vines. Lieutenant Caldwell paused at the edge of the fresh, cut trail, squinting through the haze. Ahead, the engineers had just bridged a narrow river with a Bailey section hauled in by truck. The entire operation, from setting the foundation blocks to rolling the Sherman across the span, had taken less than 2 hours. 2 hours to cross what Japanese command believed would take days to ford or bypass. Caldwell shook his head, half proud, half stunned at their own speed. We're not supposed to be here this fast. He muttered to himself. Down by the riverbank, Corporal Eddie Rivas wiped sweat from his brow and leaned on his pickaxe. Watching the tank rumble across the bridge felt surreal, like watching a battleship cruise down a back alley. The jungle screamed with cicadas, but over that chorus came the heavy metallic rhythm. A reminder that this wasn't just a patrol. This was an invasion through terrain the Japanese had staked their strategy on. Captain Robert McHale stood up in the turret of his Sherman, goggles smeared with streaks of red clay. "Keep rolling." He barked into the radio. "Don't let them breathe. They'll try to regroup on the ridge." His crew responded with short, clipped affirmatives. They weren't chasing Japanese soldiers. They were chasing their retreat, denying them every chance to reset their defenses. On the Japanese side, Captain Arima ran a trembling hand over a map that no longer made sense. The terrain features he'd marked as choke points, ravines, thickets, rivers, were turning into stepping stones for the enemy. The Americans weren't finding routes, they were making them. And their tanks were the proof. Arima had fought in China, in open plains where armor was predictable. Here it was supposed to be different. Here, the jungle was supposed to fight on his side. A runner burst into the command hut, bowing quickly. "Captain, the tanks crossed the river already." The words hit like a rifle shot. Arima's jaw clenched as he stared out toward the distant rumble. "Already," he repeated. A single word, weighted with everything that was crumbling around him. On the slope overlooking the river, Sergeant Sato's surviving platoon tried to regroup. They had pulled back through the trees, hoping to delay the Americans at the crossing point, but the tanks were already on their side of the water. The sound of treads crushing through undergrowth was relentless, steady, a sound you couldn't ambush or scare off. The Sherman turrets rotated methodically, their gunners scanning the tree line, ready to flatten any resistance that dared appear. The Japanese soldiers crouched in the ferns, whispering to each other. Most had never faced a tank at this range, let alone one that didn't respect terrain. One of them, a young conscript barely 19, clutched a Type 99 grenade as if it were a talisman. "How do we fight that?" he whispered. Sergeant Sato had no answer. The anti-tank guns were too few. The artillery too light. The air cover non-existent. What they faced wasn't just a vehicle, it was the machinery of an entire nation moving forward. Meanwhile, the American engineers didn't stop. They cut trees, laid corduroy mats, stabilized soft earth with sandbags, turning mud into roadway with a precision that stunned any observer. Some were so exhausted they could barely speak. But they worked anyway, because every minute gained meant the Japanese lost another chance to dig in. These weren't just soldiers. They were builders, fighting a war with saws and steel as much as bullets. As the column pushed past the river, Captain McHale's Sherman crested a ridge. Below, a Japanese supply depot sat half, camouflaged in the undergrowth. Rows of crates, mortar shells, food supplies, and communications gear. It had been positioned deliberately far from any road, the Japanese certain it was beyond tank range. But the tanks were here. McHale raised his hand and signaled. "Gunner, HE, that depot." The gunner's voice crackled back through the intercom, steady as the machine itself. "On the way," the 75 bomb barked. A heartbeat later, the depot disappeared in a roar of fire and splintering wood. Japanese soldiers scattered like birds flushed from cover. Ammunition popped in chaotic chain reactions. Flames licked the tree trunks, blackening the canopy. Sergeant Sato, still on the ridge's edge, saw the explosion from afar. He felt the heat wash over his face even at distance. He knew then what his captain already feared: their positions, their plans. Their carefully built supply lines were being eaten alive. Not by the jungle's betrayal, but by an enemy who had learned to master it. Caldwell climbed up beside the tank, wiping sweat and clay from his face. He watched the depot burn and said quietly, "This road wasn't here yesterday." McHale answered without looking at him, "That's the point." By nightfall, the jungle no longer looked like a jungle. Smoke curled into the canopy, the stars above flickering through the haze like distant lanterns. The low croak of frogs had returned, but it sounded foreign now. Like the soundtrack of a place that had changed hands. What was once a dense maze of vines and bamboo now bore the straight, brutal geometry of human will. A road, wide enough for tanks and supply convoys, stretched where that morning there had only been mud, roots, and silence. The Shermans idled in a staggered perimeter, their engines clicking as they cooled. Some of them were streaked with soot from the burning depot, their hulls caked with mud like the hide of some ancient beast. Men sat on their turrets, smoking lucky strikes, boots dangling, the smell of diesel mixing with the wet breath of the forest. Engineers slumped beside them, too tired to talk, some eating cold rations out of tins, some just staring into the tree line, where they'd spent the day fighting both man and nature. Captain Robert McHale climbed down from his tank, helmet under his arm. His legs ached from hours in the cramped interior, but his mind was still wired. The Japanese had thrown everything they could that afternoon: light mortar fire, snipers, a couple of anti-tank ambushes, and it hadn't stopped the advance. He tilted his head back and exhaled slowly, realizing something important. They had done in a single day what the enemy believed was impossible. Farther up the ridge, Captain Arima crouched with a handful of surviving officers. Their radio barely worked, its static a cruel echo of isolation. The enemy's tanks were on the road now, and once the Americans built a road, they didn't stop. Arima stared at the glowing horizon where his supply depot had been. "We built our defenses for a jungle war," he said quietly. "They brought their own battlefield." Lieutenant Nakamura said nothing. He didn't need to. Every man in that circle understood what it meant. Their strategy, built on terrain as a shield, was collapsing with every yard of steel track. Down by the American bivouac, Private Eddie Rivas sat against the warm hull of his Sherman, the metal still radiating the day's heat. He flicked his cigarette into the mud and leaned his head back. "You know what's crazy?" he said to the gunner beside him. "Well, built a damn road in a jungle they said tanks couldn't cross. And tomorrow we'll be 10 more miles down it." The gunner smirked, tapping his helmet. "That's why we're here, Eddie. We don't wait for roads. We make M. Nearby." Lieutenant Caldwell walked the line with a clipboard tucked under his arm. Even at night, the engineers were laying steel, matting on soft sections of the trail, making sure the supply trucks wouldn't bog down in the morning. He glanced at the blackened skeleton of a banyan tree, something that, 12 hours earlier, had stood as a natural fortress. Now it was just another marker along a growing highway through enemy territory. The Japanese tried to probe the line after dark, small raiding parties slipping through the trees, hoping to catch the Americans off guard. But the tanks weren't sleeping. Their machine guns flashed briefly, controlled bursts into the night, and the forest answered with silence. The Shermans, positioned like iron giants, were immovable. Their presence alone was a psychological hammer. The Americans could go anywhere now. In his dugout, Captain Arima stared at a single candle guttering in the damp air. His men whispered around him, reports of dwindling ammunition, broken lines, shattered morale. He had seen defeat before, but this felt different. It wasn't a single battle lost. It was the slow, unstoppable erasure of an entire strategy. The jungle was supposed to be their ally. Now it was just terrain under someone else's boots. At midnight, rain began to fall, a hard, straight tropical downpour that drummed against steel hulls and helmets. The road turned to rivers of mud, but it didn't matter. The Shermans were built for this. The bulldozers would be up again at dawn, pushing, cutting, building. The Japanese positions beyond this sector would face the same sound tomorrow: the grind of tracks, the roar of engines, the collapse of everything they thought the jungle protected. McHale stood in the rain, arms folded, water running down his face. The jungle glistened around him like something freshly broken. Behind him, dozens of men slept in their wet uniforms, surrounded by machines that had made the impossible seem effortless. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, not to anyone in particular, as if acknowledging what this meant. For the Japanese soldiers in the dark beyond the tree line, the sound of engines idling in the night was worse than any gunfire. It meant the tanks weren't leaving. The jungle had been breached. And by dawn, the road would stretch even farther, bringing with it more armor, More men, more inevitability. The Burma campaign had taught the Japanese to trust the terrain. The Americans had just proven they could change it.